The supply closet smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams when Dylan Carter pushed through the door. What he found inside changed everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start where most love stories never begin, in the shadow of rejection. In the moment when hiding feels like the only option left. Dylan's hands trembled as he adjusted his thrift store blazer outside the Four Seasons Seattle. The invitation in his pocket felt like a mistake, even though Marcus had practically dragged him here. His chosen brother, the HIV-positive activist who'd become his anchor after his biological family cast him out, believed in pushing comfort zones. Dylan believed in survival. The tech company gala buzzed with the kind of wealth that made Dylan's freelance graphic design income feel microscopic. Champagne flutes caught the light like tiny stars, and conversations flowed in the language of venture capital and market disruption. Dylan nursed a glass of water, calculating how long politeness required him to stay before he could escape back to Portland. That's when he saw Tyler. His ex-boyfriend stood near the ice sculpture, arm wrapped around Cameron Morrison. Cameron, whose family owned half of Oregon's wine country, whose trust fund could buy Dylan's apartment building. The contrast hit like a physical blow. Tyler had upgraded to exactly what Dylan could never be: wealthy, connected, safe. The panic started in Dylan's chest, that familiar crushing weight he remembered from the night his father had called him an abomination and thrown his belongings onto the porch. Fight or flight kicked in, but in a room full of Seattle's elite, there was nowhere to run except deeper into the hotel. Dylan found himself in a service corridor, heart hammering against his ribs. Hotel staff bustled past with the efficiency of ghosts. He needed somewhere to breathe, somewhere to remember that Tyler's choices weren't a judgment on his worth. The supply closet door stood slightly ajar, offering dark sanctuary. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The darkness was absolute, peaceful. Dylan leaned against the wall, finally allowing himself to feel everything he'd been swallowing. The inadequacy, the loneliness, the bone-deep exhaustion of pretending he belonged in spaces that reminded him daily that he didn't. That's when a voice spoke from the opposite corner. Alexander Reed had been hiding in supply closets since he was 12 years old. Not literally, of course, but the metaphorical ones: boardrooms where he couldn't mention weekend plans, family dinners where he deflected questions about dating, company retreats where colleagues brought spouses and he brought carefully constructed excuses. Tonight was supposed to be his victory party. Reed Enterprises had just closed the biggest merger in company history. The celebration downstairs bore his name, featured his achievements, honored his vision. And all Alexander wanted was to disappear. The closet had seemed like a reasonable solution. 5 minutes of peace before returning to smile for cameras and shake hands with investors who saw him as a profitable enigma. He hadn't expected company. The stranger who'd stumbled in was clearly as desperate for escape as Alexander was. In the dim light seeping under the door, he could make out a young man in an ill-fitting blazer, shoulders shaking with either cold or emotion. Maybe both. Alexander had spent 15 years perfecting the art of reading people. This man wasn't a threat. He was wounded. They sat in silence for several minutes, two strangers sharing the strange intimacy of mutual hiding. Finally, Dylan spoke first. His voice was rough with tears he'd been holding back all evening. The conversation that followed lasted 45 minutes and changed both their lives. Dylan found himself telling a complete stranger about the farm town in Oregon where being gay meant being erased, about working 3 jobs to put himself through community college, about building a life from nothing in Portland, surrounded by chosen family who saw his worth when his biological one couldn't, about feeling like an imposter in rooms full of people who'd never known what it meant to choose between groceries and rent. Alexander shared his own version of hiding: the pressure of inheriting Reed family expectations, the conservative parents who'd built their fortune on traditional values and couldn't imagine their son coloring outside those lines, the loneliness of success when authenticity felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, the ex-boyfriend he'd lost because fear had made him choose his closet over love. In the darkness, without faces or pretenses, they found something neither had expected: understanding, recognition, the rare gift of being seen completely by someone who had no reason to judge. When Alexander finally revealed his name, Dylan's world tilted. The CEO of Reed Enterprises, the man whose merger was being celebrated downstairs, the kind of powerful figure Dylan had spent his life feeling invisible to. But in that closet, power dynamics dissolved into something more fundamental. Two people who'd learned to hide parts of themselves, finding permission to be whole. Their first kiss happened naturally, inevitably. It tasted like possibility and fear in equal measure. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the sound of Alexander's name being called echoed down the corridor. Duty was summoning him back to his empire. Sometimes the most profound connections happen in the spaces between who we're expected to be and who we actually are. In supply closets and quiet moments, we discover that hiding doesn't have to mean being alone. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real love, courage, and the beautiful mess of finding yourself in someone else's truth. Alexander's speech that night became the stuff of Seattle business legend, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Standing at the podium with 500 guests hanging on his words, he deviated from his prepared remarks about market positioning and strategic growth. Instead, he spoke about unexpected moments that change everything, about the courage required to step into the unknown, about how sometimes the most important meetings happen in the most unlikely places. His eyes found Dylan in the back of the ballroom, and for 30 seconds, his carefully constructed professional mask slipped completely. Dylan felt every word like a personal confession. This powerful man, this CEO who commanded rooms full of investors, was essentially coming out to Seattle's business elite without saying the words directly. The vulnerability of it took Dylan's breath away. But vulnerability, Dylan had learned, was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. He slipped out before Alexander finished speaking, before the applause could trap him in conversations he wasn't equipped for. The rain had started again, turning Seattle's streets into mirrors that reflected everything Dylan couldn't have. Tyler caught up with him 3 blocks from the hotel. His ex-boyfriend looked uncomfortable in his expensive suit, like he was wearing someone else's life. The conversation that followed surprised them both. Tyler wasn't gloating about his upgrade to Cameron Morrison. He was apologetic, almost desperate. He'd seen Dylan talking to Alexander Reed, had watched the CEO's obvious interest, and suddenly Tyler's sugar daddy arrangement felt hollow by comparison. Dylan realized something profound in that moment. He'd spent 6 months healing from Tyler's rejection, building his self-worth back piece by piece. Now, facing his ex again, he felt nothing but pity. Tyler was still running from himself, still choosing financial security over emotional truth. Dylan had chosen the harder path toward authenticity, and it had made him stronger. When Alexander found him 20 minutes later, soaked from the rain and standing under a coffee shop awning, Dylan almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the polished CEO. This was just a man who chased someone through downtown Seattle because he couldn't bear the thought of letting them disappear. Their first real date happened at Victrola on Capitol Hill, in Dylan's comfort zone rather than Alexander's world of exclusive restaurants. They talked for 4 hours over coffee that cost less than the appetizers at the hotel. Alexander shared stories about the crushing weight of family expectations, about parents who'd built their fortune on timber and traditional values, about the constant performance of being the perfect son while burying the parts of himself that didn't fit their vision. Dylan talked about survival differently, about Marcus, his chosen brother who'd been there through every crisis since Dylan aged out of his family's love, about the Portland queer community that had taught him the difference between tolerance and acceptance, about building Carter Creative Studio one freelance project at a time, dreaming of the day he could afford to be selective about clients rather than grateful for anyone willing to pay his rates. For 3 months, they built something beautiful in the space between their worlds. Alexander learned to appreciate the warmth of Charlie's, the legendary gay bar where Dylan felt most himself. Dylan discovered that wealth, when wielded thoughtfully, could be a tool for good rather than just accumulation. They met each other's chosen families. Marcus fell in love with Alexander's quiet intensity and his obvious devotion to Dylan. Emily, Alexander's sister, became Dylan's fierce advocate after one dinner where she watched her brother laugh more than she'd seen in years. But shadows have a way of catching up, even in the brightest love stories. Andrew returned to Seattle on a Tuesday in March, carrying business cards and old grievances. Alexander's college boyfriend had grown into the kind of man who wore success like armor. He'd heard about Alexander's relationship through mutual friends, had seen the society page photos of them at charity events. The ultimatum was delivered with surgical precision. Come back to me, or I'll make sure the Reed Enterprises board knows exactly how their CEO spends his private time. Some of those board members had been friends of Alexander's grandfather. Men who remembered when being gay was not just scandal, but career suicide. Andrew understood that love, in Alexander's world, could still be weaponized. Dylan discovered the truth when he arrived early to Alexander's penthouse one evening, using the key he'd been given weeks before. Alexander was on the phone, pacing in his living room like a caged animal. Dylan heard enough to understand that his relationship had become a liability, that the man he loved was being forced to choose between authenticity and everything he'd built. The conversation that followed was the kind that reshapes the landscape of a relationship. Dylan had survived family rejection before. He knew the particular agony of being someone's secret shame. What broke his heart wasn't Alexander's fear. It was the familiar pattern of being asked to make himself smaller so someone else could feel safer. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to let them hide behind their fear of losing you. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is demand that they choose courage, even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted. Dylan moved back to Portland 3 days after discovering Alexander's ultimatum. He left a note explaining that love shouldn't require anyone to live in shadow, that he'd rather lose Alexander completely than watch him slowly disappear into fear. For 2 weeks, they didn't speak. Alexander threw himself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun their own heart. Dylan returned to 16-hour days building his design studio, taking on projects that barely covered rent because busyness felt safer than thinking about what he'd lost. Marcus was the one who finally staged an intervention. He showed up at Dylan's apartment with Thai food and the kind of tough love that only chosen family could deliver. He'd lived through the AIDS crisis, had watched too many friends die with regrets about chances not taken and truths not spoken. He wasn't about to let Dylan repeat those mistakes. The intervention worked because it forced Dylan to articulate what he'd been avoiding. He hadn't left Alexander because he didn't love him. He'd left because he loved him too much to watch him choose safety over authenticity. But maybe, Marcus suggested, there was a third option. Maybe instead of protecting Alexander from difficult choices, Dylan could trust him to make them. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Alexander was having his own reckoning. Emily had noticed her brother's decline and cornered him during their weekly dinner. The conversation that followed was the first honest discussion about sexuality in the Reed family history. Emily had suspected for years but waited for Alexander to trust her with his truth. Her response surprised him. She wasn't shocked or disappointed. She was angry that he'd carried the burden of hiding alone for so long. She wanted to meet Dylan, wanted to understand the man who'd made her brother happier than she'd ever seen him. Most importantly, she wanted to help Alexander find a way to stop living in fear. Alexander's coming out to his sister became the first domino in a chain reaction that would reshape his entire life. Emily became his advocate and strategist, helping him research LGBTQ-friendly investors and board members. She connected him with other business leaders who'd navigated similar challenges. Most importantly, she gave him permission to prioritize his happiness over their parents' expectations. The reconciliation happened on a rainy Thursday in April at Discovery Park. Alexander drove to Portland without calling first, parked outside Dylan's apartment building, and waited. When Dylan finally emerged for his morning coffee run, he found the man he loved sitting on a bench across the street, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. The conversation that brought them back together wasn't dramatic or movie perfect. It was honest, painful, and necessary. Alexander apologized for letting fear make decisions for both of them. Dylan apologized for running instead of fighting for what they'd built together. They talked about trust, about the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. More importantly, They talked about what courage looked like in practice. Alexander had started the process of coming out to carefully selected board members. He'd discovered that his fears about universal rejection were largely unfounded. Some relationships might shift, some doors might close, but new ones would open. The business world had evolved more than his anxiety had allowed him to recognize. Dylan shared his own evolution. The 2 weeks apart had clarified something important. He'd been so focused on not repeating the patterns of his family rejection that he'd forgotten relationships could be different when both people chose growth over comfort. Their first pride together became a milestone neither had expected. Alexander, who'd spent decades in various closets, found himself holding Dylan's hand in broad daylight on Capitol Hill. Dylan, who'd attended Pride as a celebration of survival, now experienced it as a celebration of love. The photos that surfaced on social media the next week would create ripple effects neither anticipated. But for one perfect June afternoon, surrounded by their community and bathed in rainbow light, they existed in a space where hiding wasn't necessary and love wasn't a liability. When Alexander finally took Dylan home to meet his parents in Bellevue, the conversation was stilted but civil. His mother asked polite questions about Dylan's work while clearly struggling to reconcile her son's choices with her expectations. His father said little but shook Dylan's hand when they left. Small steps, Emily reminded them, were still steps forward. Change rarely happens in grand gestures. More often, it unfolds in quiet moments of choice, in daily decisions to prioritize authenticity over comfort. The strongest relationships aren't built on avoiding conflict, but on navigating it together, with honesty and grace. The attack came during Reed Enterprises' annual investor gala in September, 6 months after Alexander had begun his gradual coming out process. Dylan attended as Alexander's official partner, no longer hidden but not yet entirely comfortable in the spotlight that came with dating Seattle's most eligible CEO. Richard Steinberg, a longtime business partner with old-fashioned values and new money arrogance, had clearly been drinking since cocktail hour. When he cornered Dylan near the silent auction tables, his words carried the sharp edge of alcohol and prejudice. The confrontation started with seemingly innocent questions about Dylan's family background and education. But Steinberg's tone made it clear these weren't genuine inquiries. He was establishing hierarchy, making sure Dylan understood he was charity case in a room full of legitimate wealth. When Dylan tried to excuse himself politely, Steinberg grabbed his arm. The touch was aggressive, possessive, designed to demonstrate power. Dylan had experienced this kind of intimidation before, but never in a ballroom full of Alexander's professional contacts. What followed happened quickly but felt like slow motion. Steinberg's voice rose as he questioned what exactly Dylan brought to the relationship besides obvious attractions. The implication was clear and degrading. Several nearby conversations stopped. Heads turned. Alexander, who'd been across the room discussing quarterly projections, noticed the commotion. Dylan watched the moment Alexander had to choose: professional discretion or personal loyalty, image management or authentic partnership. The old Alexander might have handled it quietly, privately, diplomatically. The man who'd been learning to live authentically made a different choice. Alexander crossed the ballroom with purpose. His voice, when he addressed Steinberg, carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He made it clear that disrespecting Dylan was disrespecting him, that partnership meant protection, and that anyone uncomfortable with those terms was welcome to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. In a room full of Seattle's business elite, Alexander Reed had just publicly claimed his gay relationship and dared anyone to challenge him. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others seemed impressed by his conviction. A few, including several potential investors, quietly approached Dylan later to apologize for Steinberg's behavior. But consequences, Dylan had learned, were rarely immediate or neat. The news cycle that followed was brutal. Conservative business publications questioned Alexander's judgment. Some longtime clients requested meetings to discuss concerns about Reed Enterprises' leadership stability. Andrew, who'd been lurking in the background for months, seized the opportunity to suggest that Alexander's personal life was becoming a professional liability. The Reed family dinner that Sunday was the conversation Alexander had been avoiding since adolescence. His parents had seen the coverage, had fielded calls from their country club friends, had spent the week preparing talking points about their son's choices. The discussion was painful but necessary. Alexander's father worried about the company reputation and shareholder confidence. His mother struggled with her own assumptions about masculinity and family legacy, but Emily, fierce in her brother's defense, reminded them that love and business success weren't mutually exclusive. Dylan, meanwhile, retreated to Portland, feeling responsible for the chaos surrounding Alexander's life. The pattern was familiar, the guilt overwhelming. He'd brought instability to someone else's carefully constructed world. Again, Marcus wouldn't let him disappear into self-blame. The intervention this time was gentler but equally direct. Dylan's trauma responses were understandable, but they weren't facts. Alexander had made choices knowing the potential costs. Protecting him from consequences he was prepared to face wasn't love. It was control disguised as sacrifice. The separation lasted 3 weeks this time. Alexander used the space to have difficult conversations with board members, investors, and family. Some relationships shifted. A few business connections proved to be built on foundations too shallow to weather change, but others deepened when tested by honesty. Reed Enterprises didn't collapse. Stock prices fluctuated, then stabilized. The company's inclusion initiatives, which Alexander announced during this period, attracted new talent and clients who valued authenticity over traditional corporate culture. The reconciliation happened during Portland Pride. When Alexander showed up uninvited to volunteer at the booth Dylan's design studio was sponsoring, he spent the day selling rainbow merchandise and handing out resources for LGBTQ youth, visibly and proudly supporting the community he was finally brave enough to claim. That evening, as they walked through Laurelhurst Park watching families pack up picnics, Alexander apologized not for the consequences of his choices, but for taking so long to make them. Dylan apologized for letting fear disguise itself as protection. They talked about partnership differently now, not as two people hiding from the world together, but as allies committed to changing the world around them. Love wasn't about finding someone to hide with. It was about finding someone worth being brave for. Crisis has a way of clarifying what matters most. When external pressure forces us to choose between safety and authenticity, we discover who we really are and what we're truly willing to fight for. The proposal happened exactly 1 year after their first meeting, but not in the supply closet where it all began. Alexander had bigger plans than nostalgia. Carter Creative Studio had evolved into something Dylan barely recognized. What started as his desperate freelance hustle had grown into a thriving agency specializing in LGBTQ nonprofit branding. The office space in Portland's Pearl District buzzed with creative energy and purposeful work. Dylan employed 6 people now, all of them passionate about using design to amplify marginalized voices. Alexander's investment hadn't made it possible, but his faith in Dylan's vision had accelerated everything. More importantly, their partnership had taught Dylan to dream bigger than survival. The Reed Carter Foundation launched that October with a mission that felt deeply personal to both men. They'd identified a crisis that statistics couldn't capture, but both had lived. LGBTQ youth homelessness affected thousands of kids who aged out of family love before they aged out of needing homes. Their first project was a housing program in partnership with Portland's Q Center. Safe apartments for teens who'd been rejected by their families but weren't old enough for complete independence. Each unit came with counseling support, educational resources, and most importantly, a community of chosen family. Dylan found himself mentoring kids who reminded him painfully of his 18-year-old self. Marcus, now in his 50s but still fierce in his activism, helped train volunteers to provide HIV education and general health advocacy. The program was small but mighty, serving 24 young people in its first year. Alexander's parents required more time to evolve. His mother attended their engagement party, but still struggled to make conversation with Dylan's Portland friends. His father shook hands stiffly and wrote generous checks to their foundation, while avoiding direct discussion of what it supported. But Emily became the ally neither man had expected. She moved to Portland to oversee the foundation's operations, throwing herself into LGBTQ advocacy work with a determination she'd once reserved for corporate law. Her presence bridged worlds that had felt incompatible for too long. The wedding itself reflected everything they'd learned about authentic love. They exchanged vows at Overlook Park with Mount Hood as their witness in both their families, chosen and biological, in attendance. Marcus officiated with a ceremony that honored struggle and celebrated joy in equal measure. Dylan wore a suit he'd designed himself, midnight blue with embroidered details inspired by the wildflowers that grew around his childhood home in Oregon. Alexander chose simple elegance that let his happiness be the focal point. Emily served as both their witness and photographer, documenting moments that would become family treasures. The reception featured Portland food trucks and a playlist spanning decades of queer anthems. Alexander's business colleagues mingled awkwardly but genuinely with Dylan's chosen family. Conversations happened in languages of love that transcended class and background. But the most meaningful moment came during the toasts. When Tyler approached the microphone uninvited, Dylan tensed, remembering their complicated history. But Tyler's words surprised everyone, including himself. He spoke about watching Dylan transform heartbreak into purpose, about seeing real love for the first time in his ex-boyfriend's relationship with Alexander. He apologized for his own cowardice and thanked Dylan for modeling what courage looked like in practice. The forgiveness in Dylan's hug afterward healed wounds neither man had realized they were still carrying. 3 years later, the Reed Carter Foundation had expanded to serve over 200 youth across the Pacific Northwest. Their model had been replicated in other cities by advocates who understood that housing was healthcare, that safety was a human right, and that chosen family could heal trauma that biological family had caused. Alexander's business had evolved too. Reed Enterprises became known as much for its inclusion initiatives as its financial success. The company's mentorship programs, anti-discrimination policies, and visible LGBTQ leadership attracted talent from around the country. Dylan discovered that success, when built on authentic foundation, felt different than he'd imagined. Carter Creative Studios' waiting list stretched 6 months out, but he'd learned to be selective about clients who aligned with their values. Money mattered less when work felt like mission. On quiet Sunday mornings, they still found themselves in supply closets, metaphorically speaking, spaces where they could be completely themselves without performance or pretense. But now they had an entire life built around that authenticity. A home where hiding wasn't necessary, a community where they could be whole. The teenager who reached out through the foundation's website that December reminded Dylan why their work mattered. The kid was 17, living in his car outside Eugene, trying to finish high school while managing the trauma of family rejection. His message was simple but devastating. He'd found their website and wanted to know if their program had room for one more. Dylan called personally. They made room. Sometimes the most powerful legacy we can leave is proof that survival is possible, that rejected kids can grow into men who build families and businesses and foundations, that love, when lived authentically, has the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Have you ever had to choose between hiding and being hurt? What would you do if staying safe meant staying small? Share your story below and subscribe to Heart Stories for more real love, real struggle, and real triumph over everything that tries to dim your light.